Hello my friends, welcome back to the channel. I hope that things are well in your world. Alright, so we've got a little bit of a clickbaity title up here in how MTG Draft failed or MTG Draft died. And I want to start out by saying, whatever game that you enjoy playing, play it the way that you want to, and have fun playing your video games, card games, board games, whatever it is. I'm not here to yuck anybody's yum. But I did come to a realization over time of why I began to really dislike MTG Draft and started to get drawn to games such as Autobattlers. It kind of started when Auto Chess first came out as a Dota 2 mod. I started checking that out and playing it, enjoyed it, began to stream some Underlords, and these days I'm streaming Hearthstone's Battlegrounds after having played Storybook Brawl and Teamfight Tactics, and I like these style of games in a way that I just don't like Draft anymore. And I was finally able to kind of put my finger on why and where it went wrong. I want to share that with you because I believe that many of you that enjoyed the old way that Draft used to work and are feeling frustrated now might really enjoy transitioning to these auto battler games, and at least make those of you aware of why you like Draft so much more now, what it is that changed that did that. I don't think this was necessarily a bad change from Wizards of the Coast perspective. It was just a bad change for me and those of us that really enjoyed Limited the way it used to be. So let's dive in here and talk about this. So I'm not going to go so basic as to try to explain what Draft is. I imagine if you're here, you understand what Draft is, and I am going to say Draft focused, but I'm going to cover a couple of other things too as we're on the way there. Draft was originally a fan-made and created way to play Magic. Much like Cube and much like Commander and Gladiator and all of these other formats, it was a way that people played with the cards that WotC designed. WotC designed cards generally to be played in what at the time was standard. It was like Type 1 and Type 2. None of that really matters, but they kind of designed cards for Constructed, and people found other fun ways to play with them. Over time, WotC began designing cards for these different formats, including Draft, eventually Commander, as well as even Cube is now kind of curated by like teams on Magic Online and Arena. But we can kind of come back to that difference initially in Draft and at the time Type 2 or Type 1, whatever it was, Constructed. In Constructed games at the time, you would have incredibly powerful decks that were very focused on doing their thing. And then your opponent would have a deck, and it was kind of about who could do the powerful thing first. There was a deck called Keldoran Outpost, or Counterpost is really what it was called. And all they would do in Standard was counter every spell you played and eventually make 1/1s with a land and kill you with the 1/1s. I played a deck that was built around a Soul Devi Digger combo that basically ran your own deck entirely out of cards and then recycled one card over and over, usually a lightning bolt, and you'd either kill their creatures or just start throwing it at their face. There was a Prosperous Bloom deck that looked to draw your entire deck and then just kind of vomit it out on the table. You get the idea. Two people sit down across the table from each other, their decks are trying to do their own thing, and there's not a whole lot of interaction. That's what Constructed Magic was at the time. I didn't like that. Draft was this whole new world. It was very different, okay? Because we're looking for creatures, we're looking for removal, and it's an entirely different play pattern. Like, the idea at this point is that Draft is just different, right? Like, I went deep for it. I learned it in and out, and it gave you something different, right? Like, you had to read the table. You needed to understand what the other players were picking and what they were not. You're dodging, you're weaving. When you get to the gameplay, you need to learn how to ration your removal, how to be patient, calculating, make sure you're firing things off at the right time. You'd use your life total as a resource, hold up removal if there's a combat trick. Like, you need to understand the intricacies of creature combat, which really wasn't a thing in Constructed that much. You need to know how to draft if there were new players or pros that are sitting next to you. Like, it was just a very different experience, and it had two parts. There was the draft, and there was the gameplay. And very early on, you could win the draft. And when I say win the draft, I mean really win it. The design philosophy was that there would be awful cards in a set, like 5 mana do nothing 3/3s, just terrible statted creatures. And if you read the table and knew what was open, you'd get a very powerful deck. Mirage was one of the first sets designed to be drafted, and it had a Fireball variant, Karavek's Torch at common. Like, if you could notice that you were being passed those, it meant that red was open. And if you would like latch onto that, you'd have a very strong deck, and the other players would kind of have a pile of garbage cards. This led to people who were good at draft winning a lot, and people who were new to draft losing quickly and going home frustrated. And WotC made a design change at that point. A lot of people may think that that is the change that I'm talking about, and it's not. I think this was a good change. It happened probably 15 years ago at this point. I've gotten a little bit old. But the idea is, instead of these skill testers and just really bad cards, what we're going to do now is have strong cards and okay cards. Cards that are fine. They're not great, but they're okay. There's a definite difference in power level, but the bad cards aren't as bad. That means that the good player can still get the strongest deck. I say the good player, I mean the good drafter. And the new player can still have a deck that functions and can win some games. They're still not going to win very often. They're going to lose more often than someone who's very good in practice. But this began to lead to discussions about draft. I can remember some of them at my local game store. Shout out to Adventures in Comics and Games in Sacramento. You guys are great. Where people would start to ask, why is this person winning at draft so much? And like they'd begin talking about it. I was one of the people asking that and learning at the time. And that's when I began to get find draft videos and go on this journey that eventually led me to content creation. Was I wanted to get good at draft, and it was super interesting to me and so deep and so different. These other fan-made formats had their own uniqueness too, and their own differences as well. Like, I didn't play a lot of Cube and Commander prior to WotC really beginning to design for them, but I did bump into cubes that were unique. Pauper cubes, mono green cubes, mono artifact cubes. It wasn't necessarily about doing the most powerful thing that you could while your opponent is trying to do that. But once WotC got involved and began putting cubes on Magic Online and MTG Arena, that's kind of what the cubes are about now. Now, you can still find people that play in paper and have very different cubes and they're interesting, but most content creators who are talking about cube are talking about a cube that is kind of like the greatest hits of Magic. And you're drafting very powerful cards, very synergistic cards. There's no bad cards at the table, and all of the cards are incredibly strong. It's a flat power level. So it kind of doesn't matter what you pick. You can kind of draft what you want. It's not really about seeing what's open. It's about drafting a deck as you're going through and picking what you want. So Cube kind of got changed from something that was really unique into it's this one thing where your deck is trying to do something, your opponent's deck is trying to do something, and you're seeing who could do it first. So the gameplay in Cube became a lot more like the gameplay in constructed formats. Commander kind of had this unique thing, and it resisted being pulled into this flat but high power level for a long time because there really has never been a great way to play it digitally. You could play it on Magic Online, but it was kind of awful. And a big part of the Commander experience is the social experience. Commander is a game that I think is best enjoyed with friends. You can certainly play it competitively if you want to, but things get a little weird. And there's all the politics involved, that kept things out. But at its base, most people these days think of Commander decks as incredibly powerful decks that are trying to do something. And then you've got three opponents that are trying to do their thing, and we're going to see who can do it first. So Commander and Cube eventually kind of became the same thing as constructed formats, and Draft held out for a long time, still being unique, still being very focused on creature combat, still being very rewarding if you could read the table. But it finally did fall, and I was finally able to put my finger on exactly when it happened, how it happened, why it happened, and why maybe more people are interested in it now, but the players who really loved Draft back in the day may be kind of sick of it. All right, I'm going to tell you when and how Draft died, but I want to one more time emphasize the big differences in these formats. If you played Cube at someone's house 20 years ago, it was a vastly different experience than logging onto Arena and playing the Arena Cube now. The Cube could be designed around their favorite cards. Maybe they loved Thalids, and it's an all Thalid Cube and cards that make sense with Thalids. Like the power level was vastly different and decided upon by the creator. If you played EDH in the beginning of EDH, and I did play it way back then on Magic Online on Skype with a group of friends, we would design decks kind of around, like, I had a cat deck that had a cat, legendary cat that didn't do anything, and all of the cards in it were cats, and they were bad. There was no combos. I wasn't trying to do anything. I just liked cats, so I made a cat deck. That was a lot more common back then. If you compare that now to the cube that's on Arena, it's all about power and synergy. And if you pop open some pre-constructed commander decks, you're going to find a deck that is about power and synergy. Can you improve it? Absolutely. Can you make it your own? Sure. But it's about power and synergy. So let's talk about draft and how it avoided that for so long, and exactly kind of where I think it went wrong. You may think it went right, and that's absolutely okay, but it's what made me uninterested in the game anymore. So way back in the day, you didn't just draft a set, you drafted a block. When a new set came out, you drafted 3 packs of that set for about 3 months, and then another set would come out and it's added into the mix. And I think Theros is honestly one of the best examples of this. When the original Theros set came out, there was a very synergistic deck built around Grey Merchant that people were super into, and it was fun to build. Like, you would draft a lot of cards with a lot of black mana symbols in their casting cost. You would draft Grey Merchant, which would basically drain your opponent for the amount of black mana symbols in the casting cost of permanents you control, and the Grey Merchant was a common. So you could build a very synergistic deck around this card, and there was definitely a Grey Merchant deck. Then we had Born of the Gods come out, and now instead of drafting 3 packs of Theros, or just switching to 3 packs of Born of the Gods, we're doing 1 pack of Born of the Gods and 2 packs of Theros. You could still do the Grey Merchant deck. It was a lot harder, because Born of the Gods had new mechanics and no Grey Merchants. So even though you were still getting 2 packs of this common, you couldn't really go as heavy synergy as you used to. Now you had to start taking into account card power level, and this began to change the game. The drafts and the gameplay became less about synergy and more about power level. And then finally, Journey into Nyx came out, and you're drafting 1 pack of each. Now the Grey Merchant deck is basically gone. You can't draft it at all, because if you're lucky, you might get 1, and you can't build a deck around that 1 card. So you had this environment where draft changed from being very heavy synergy dependent to a mix of synergy and power to then becoming all about power. And it was a fun cycle of rotation. Now, when they announced they were getting rid of the block structure, I didn't quite realize what that was going to do, but what it did was basically turn draft into a lower power cube. The card's power level flattened all of a sudden. Instead of commons that were good and commons that were okay, which is how we did it before, now all of the commons are okay. There's uncommons that are pretty good and rares that are very powerful. So every draft set is essentially a synergy format. You can kind of see this with a set like Kaldheim. If you think of the very powerful cards in Kaldheim, many of which were snow-based cards, they're kind of trash outside of Kaldheim. If you took a powerful Kaldheim card, I forget what it was called, but there was an Icy Manipulator that needed snow mana, and just put that card by itself, which was very good in Kaldheim, but you take that and put it into Midnight Hunt, the card just literally doesn't do anything. And that's kind of how the formats began to transition. The power level of the commons flattened, and then the synergy was all that you draft about. Now, you may not quite recognize it there, but that's exactly what Cube is. Draft basically died when we got rid of the block structure, and it just became another way to play Cube with different cards. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing if you really enjoy Cube, and a lot of people do. It's a fun way to play decks, but it means that Limited eventually became you drafting a deck that's trying to do something, your opponent drafting a deck that's trying to do something, and seeing who can do it first. Which means that all of the different formats in Magic are kind of doing the same thing. They all have a way that you acquire the deck before you play it, whether it's, picking your commander and choosing cards that go with it flavorfully or powerfully, or just finding a deck on the internet for standard, or this activity, which is kind of what drafting is now. There's this activity you do before the game. The game is playing the Magic. The draft is the activity you do first. And for me, it used to be backwards. The draft was the game. I won the game at the draft table and then had the formality of playing out the cards to prove that I'd done it right. Whereas now, you do this activity to get your deck, and then you really play the game of Magic. And that shift was different for me. And it kind of made me feel like all of Magic is sort of the same thing. They're different cards, but it's kind of the same game. And that was disappointing for me. That's where I began to really get into these auto battlers, which initially may seem like they don't have a lot in common with Magic, but I'm going to make the case that they do, and that I think you should try one out. It doesn't even matter which one it is, but let me try to sell you on it for 1 second. My background is in sales, so I'm not going to push hard, but I can make the case for why I really enjoy them, and I think it would be worth you looking into them if you used to really love draft, and you found yourself over the last few years thinking, man, I'm still drafting, and it's still fun sometimes, but it's just not what it used to be. Well, it isn't. But there is somewhere you can find that. I'll use Hearthstone's Battlegrounds as an example because that's what I've been playing lately, but it works the same with any of them. The way these games work is there's a shared pool of cards, units, whatever, that you're picking while you're in a group of 8 other players. Does this sound familiar? It should, because this is basically what pod drafting used to be. And you're selecting units, cards, whatever, for power level and for synergy. There's a shop phase where you pick 1 or 2 cards out of a pack in the shop, and then the units automatically battle someone else in your pod, and this repeats back and forth. Basically what this is a draft game where you don't have to do the annoying playing the game part at the end. All that there is the drafting. You're drafting your units. They do the battles automatically. There is something about positioning, and there's always something unique with these games, whether it's, the quests from Battlegrounds, treasures from Storybook Brawl, or the items from Teamfight Tactics. But it all boils down to you're selecting the units that you want to play from a shop, and then you're using that to battle 8 other people in your pod. Now, a big complaint I hear from a lot of people about auto battlers in general is the level of RNG that's involved. I was trying to build a Quillbore deck and there weren't enough of them in the shop. I was trying to go for arcane units, but I didn't get the right items. Sure, that's certainly a part of it, but that's also a part of Magic. It's inherently built into the mana system. Like, there's plenty of games of Magic that I lost because I never drew the 4th land, and that happens in auto battlers too. It's just kind of presented in a different way. From my perspective, in Magic, let's say I'm playing a game of Limited and I never draw my 3rd land realistically, I basically don't get to play, right? Like, my opponent does their thing and I'm sitting here just discarding cards and unhappy until they kill me. And the auto battlers, yeah, the RNG's there, and sometimes you don't find all of the dwarves that you're looking for to build your team, but you're still playing the game while that's happening. And you can also take steps to minimize that, like recognize that you're not getting them and maybe decide to go for power level and try to play for 4th place instead of 1st. So I think the RNG is there in both ways, but I think it works out a little differently in favor of the auto battlers where you're at least still playing the game. And the other big part for me that was a huge reason to make the transition is content creation and being a father. You may be able to hear my baby babbling off in the background now as I'm making this video, and as soon as I'm done, I'm going to go smile at her and snuggle with her and tell my wife I love her. I'm a family man, Travis, now. If I did a Magic draft, whether it's best of 1 or best of 3, and tried to make a recording out of that, it takes about 2 uninterrupted hours to do that. And that's just not really possible when you have an 8-month-old. In addition, generally speaking, when I post drafts on YouTube or like take Twitch content and move it to YouTube for discoverability, I don't want it to be a 1st-round loss. So that means I'm invested in 2 hours of time to make a video that I may not even be able to post. Compare that to the length of time your average auto battler game takes. from start to finish, they're generally over in 30 minutes to 45 minutes. That's just a much easier chunk of time for me to be able to set aside. And if I draft a bad Magic deck, there's something in me that compels me to still try. Even if I just do horribly in the draft, I'm like, this deck is going to 0-3, I still have to try, which means I'm kind of invested in 2 hours at a shot either way, no matter what I'm doing. Whereas again, in Battlegrounds, if I'm doing terribly and making dumb decisions, at least I get my ass kicked and I'm done in 30 minutes and I don't have to sit there and suffer through it. And I think that's just a matter of these games being designed to go quickly on a computer versus Magic being designed to be played, slower and at a local game store. They've tried to speed up Magic with things like Best of One and more powerful, more flexible cards that end the games quicker, and you can see that too, and maybe that's good for Magic, but it still takes a lot longer to play a draft from start to finish than it does to play around with any of the Autobattlers. So that's the big reason that I'm attracted to Autobattlers now, and I find myself playing Hearthstone's Battlegrounds after having checked out so many of the others. And like I said, I really loved Underlords for a long time. That game just kind of fell apart. But they're giving me what I used to get from Draft, which is that feeling of I can make selections in a group of 8 players and make the best selections and win at that table. And that's what I wanted from Draft. I just can't get that from Draft anymore because that's not what it's about. I strongly believe that there aren't different formats of Magic the Gathering. There's just one way to play, and it's powerful deck trying to do something with some number of opponents that have a powerful deck trying to do something, and there's some interesting activity that you do to get the cards to make that deck first, whether it's pick them out from your collection, buy them at a game store, or select them from a pack that you've opened. That's not the game anymore. The game is the powerful deck trying to do its thing. So that's why I'm not playing Draft and not playing Magic anymore, is it's all kind of the same thing. But I understand that a lot of people like that style of play, and that's okay. Again, play what you want to play, enjoy what you enjoy. But again, if you found yourself thinking, Draft just isn't as fun as it used to be, come check out some of these Autobattlers with me. I think you'll be surprised how much you enjoy it. All right, thanks for listening to an old man yell at the clouds. Tell me in the comments what you think. Am I right? Am I wrong? Am I stupid? Am I smart? Do I smell bad? Leave a comment. All right, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing what you guys and gals have to say, and hopefully see you on the stream. It's at twitch.tv/Semulin. We stream Battlegrounds currently on the weekends. All right, thank you so much. And a big thank you to my patrons. Thank you, Brad, Punk, Jesse, Jacob, Scott, Fasty, Rich, Brandon, Jazzy, Craig, and Geis. I appreciate y'all.